Verdens største religion, kristendommen, med rundt 2,3 milliarder tilhengere, oppstod nettopp I Midtøsten. Helt frem til 600-tallet etter Kristus dominerte kristentroen hele Midtøsten-regionen. Det siste tiåret, og særlig etter USAs Irak-krig I 2003, har det pågått en stadig destabilisering, der intolerante, totalitære islamistiske grupper, ofte med tilknytning til Saudi-Arabia, har florert. Midtøstens kristne minoriteter utsettes I dag for så betydelige forfølgelser, at man snakker om at hele kristentroen I ferd med å bli utryddet fra regionen.
Mr. Raymond Ibrahim, thank you for being here today. You are a world-leading expert in the studies of Middle East, Islam, and radical Islam. And we who live in this age know just too well how much has happened the past 10, 20 years in the Islamic world. And watching especially how, for example, the invasion of USA into Iraq has left the country in ashes. And seeing also the long and lasting Afghanistan war, the longest war in American history. And then again, finding how the Arab Spring really has turned into such a cold winter. You go even further and say that the USA today has turned into the chief facilitator for persecution of Christians.
Sure, I base this statement on the fact that a new report came out a couple of months ago by a well-known international human rights organization that listed the top 50 worst countries for Christians. And among the top 10, which they're categorized as severe persecution, these are the worst. And then there's more moderate persecution and so forth. But in the top 10 severe persecution are countries like Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Okay, now before, what these four countries have in common as well, of course, is U.S. intervention. And so, for example, we know, of course, Afghanistan, post 9/11, the war, and so forth. And we're familiar with the fact that the Taliban was ousted. And of course, in the popular mind, the Taliban's the bad, radical, jihadist organization, and so forth. But you come to find out that, well, over 10 years after that, the last Christian church was actually destroyed under the eyes of the U.S. by the Afghani government that it just put into power a decade ago, for example. And all kinds of other laws in Afghanistan are still set in place, the same laws that the Taliban was using against Christian minorities. And now it's the same thing in countries, of course, like Iraq. As we all know, after Saddam was ousted, the Christian population in the various sects and so forth, well over half has been decimated and sent away, and just their churches attacked, burned, destroyed. And this was in the name, of course, as in Afghanistan, democracy. So we brought democracy to Afghanistan, brought democracy to Iraq, and now those countries are much worse in persecution than before. And it's the same in Libya, for example. Libya has a very tiny Christian population, and you never heard of anything happening to them under Gaddafi. Once Gaddafi's gone, now you're hearing about Christians have been killed, accused of proselytizing, thrown in jail. Churches, very, very small amount of churches, mostly are Coptic from neighboring Egypt, have been attacked, burned, destroyed. Nuns have been harassed and kicked out. And then, of course, you have Syria ongoing, and again, in the name of getting rid of this terrible dictator and bringing democracy. You have Islamic jihadis supported by the United States. And as we know, the human rights of Christians specifically have been taken a nosedive, and they've been attacked and, of course, expelled, abducted, beheaded, churches bombed, nuns, of course, attacked.
We all remember how Mr. Samuel Huntington, back then in 1993, wrote The Clash of Civilizations, suggesting that the clashes will really come because cultures simply do not understand one another. And thus to say that the West doesn't really understand and comprehend what is really going on in the Middle East. And because of the lack of true knowledge and too much propaganda maybe from some sources in the Middle East towards the United States, one ends up in a situation where one actually supports jihadis and people that do these atrocities. Is this really the case? Or is the case really that the West is much more cynical than that we actually think that human rights is something we protect so long as we talk about our own Western people? But when it comes to the Middle East and other places, we don't really care. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's a little of both. On the one hand, of course, there's the naivety and the Arab Spring, as you mentioned before. So, these countries that I mentioned, in the context of the Arab Spring, of course, it was portrayed as a great democratic movement, and the United States or other Western countries must support the rebels and help bring democracy and so forth. But as you've seen, those four countries, I mentioned them specifically because before the U.S. intervened on behalf of the rebels, the human rights of Christians were much better. Now they are considered severe persecutors. They're worse than countries like Saudi Arabia now, for example. But as far as the cynicism and all that, well, of course, that's another part of it. And you see that in the fact that who's a victim and who's not depends on if they fit the political agenda of the West. And if it's someone that somehow helps the agenda, then even in Syria, for example, Barack Hussein Obama wanted to go to war, and he was claiming the human rights of some Syrians being killed by Bashar Assad with chemical weapons. And of course, he had no proof. It was an allegation. And if anything, others were saying that it was the jihadis were killing people with chemicals. And even Putin himself, the Russian president, made a very good point. He asked Obama, saying, what will you do if it turns out that the rebels are killing people? And of course, there's no answer. And this again goes to show you that it's not about the human rights and coming to the rescue, but it's about if it fits the agenda, the political, cynical agenda. So it's really a combination of all those factors.
Bidrar vi I Vesten I realiteten til dette massemordet gjennom vår aktive krigføring? Ibrahim selv egypter, han kopter, betegnelsen på de nærmere 15 millioner kristne som bor I Egypt. Hva vil det egentlig si å være en kopter?
In America, if I say I'm a Copt, most people ask me, which police precinct do you work for? And that, of course, shows the fact that people are just completely oblivious. But the Copts are the most indigenous inhabitants of the land of Egypt. In fact, the Coptic language is the spoken words that the Pharaonic people spoke with Greek letters and so forth. And even the word Copt, I think it's interesting to know, all it means is Egyptian. So the Greek word that we get Egyptian from is Aegyptos. And so when the Arab conquerors came, they just dropped the first part, and it just became Gypt. And then, Gypt, and in English it's called Copt. So a Copt is just a native Egyptian, but of course they're all associated with Christianity because they were all Christians before the Arabs came in from the Muslim conquest and, of course, converted them by the sword and so forth. And many Copts today, of course, have converted over the centuries of conquest and so forth.
But we've been hearing now, especially since after the Arab Spring as well, there seems to be a lot of persecution against particular minorities in the Middle East, more than it used to be. I mean, we hear stories about churches being burned, young girls being raped just because they are Copts and not belong to the majority of Muslims in Egypt.
Exactly. So on the one hand, they're ostracized for that very reason, because they're not part of the group. They're not part of the tribe, they're outsiders. And worse than that, they're Christians, which of course from Islamic dogma are seen a little substandard. At best they're called dhimmis, or second class, third class citizens who have to live in a certain, low-key way. And so I think this sort of worldview from Muslims permeates the masses, and so they start treating them, of course, as the scapegoats, the victims. So, for example, in the most recent attacks on Copts, the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, were in Egypt, and many Egyptians, including Muslims, the majority of them were Muslims, did not like the Muslim Brotherhood for their Islamist activism and agenda. So the June 30 revolution, of course, which was led by the military and saw 10, 20, 30, 40 million Egyptians in the streets, ousted the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, retaliated how? Because according to Islamic law, you're not supposed to attack a fellow Muslim. So what they did is, to get back at the military and at the country's reputation, they went on a killing the Copts. And up to 80 churches in 2 weeks were actually burned and bombed and destroyed. And Copts were beheaded and abducted and raped and so forth. And all that was because we want to retaliate against, the Egyptian people and the military. So who are you going to go after? You go after the scapegoats, the infidels, the other, because according to Islamic law, they're not protected as a Muslim. So
it's a strange thing, because we seem to have such high opinion of human rights and the protection of those in the West. But do you have a feeling that we somewhat think that it's important that Westerners are protected by the human rights? Because we somehow seem to do quite little to help people that are not from the West, seem like human rights really doesn't apply to them.
Well, absolutely. It's a very selective agenda. We say human rights and it sounds universal and so forth, but it depends, I suppose, on which humans. When it comes to Christians, Copts, and all these people, and I say this because, of course, the media doesn't even want to mention it, let alone human rights organizations or the government, they're being, if you objectively look at it, they're probably at the worst humanitarian crisis right now, is being directed against Christians, millions around the world. And of course, as you say, the New York Times will rarely or ever mention this, except if something really dramatic happens and 50 Christians die in a church in Nigeria or so forth. Speaking of Nigeria, where half the population is Christian and are under complete attack by Boko Haram, a jihadist organization, thousands of Christians killed, thousands of churches destroyed. New York Times finally was able to report on Islamic radicalism in Nigeria, but not in the context of Christian persecution, but in the persecution of homosexuals. So because the New York Times found, we're staying with the theme of who's a victim, whose human rights do we care about. So the human rights of gays is something the New York Times and the mainstream media are keen on, and that's fine.
Which is a wonderful
thing. It's fine. But if you do the numbers, okay, there's probably for every one gay that gets attacked in Nigeria, maybe 100 or 1,000 Christians, simply because they're more obvious. They're out in the open. They go in church and there they are. We know who they are. They're infidels. We kill them. Churches are bombed. Being a homosexual, they're just lesser numbers anyway, just like in any country, and they're not that obvious. And yet, so if the New York Times actually thought that the life of a Christian and a gay person were equal, and one hopes they do, then you would have thought they'd be shedding even more light about the plight of Christians, and yet there's nothing.
Ibrahim ser ut til å mene at vestlige ledere har en annen agenda. Man er ikke opptatt av det som skjer med de sivile og minoriteter i Midtøsten. Presset mot kristne er sterkt økende, også i vestlige land, med politiske eliter som aktivt skyver troen ut av det offentlige rom. Vi tilhører en avkristnet kultur, som i henhold til åndelige ledere slik som Billy Graham ligner mer på Sodoma og Gomorra. Derfor har Ibrahim skrevet boken «Korsfestet igjen», avsløringer av islams nye krig mot kristne, i håp om at vi kan våkne og forstå alvoret. Blir ikke dette stanset, vil Europa stå for tur.
The purpose of the book is to try to show some sort of continuity between what Muslim persecution has done to Christians in the past, historically, and what is happening today. Christian persecution right now, maybe 90 or 85% of it is happening by Muslims, and most people aren't aware of that. Most people aren't aware that Christians are being persecuted at all. But the purpose of this book was I tried to approach it methodically by beginning a little bit with the doctrine of Islam, the Sharia, and showing in various phases how Islamic law treats certain things of Christian worship, including Christian worship itself, churches, crosses, monasteries, Christian freedom to speak your mind or to proselytize and spread the gospel around, or even to be critical of Islam, for example. And I showed the Quranic and scriptural texts that made it clear that Christians don't have any freedom in this sense, and they don't have freedom to build churches or even to really worship fully, freely. And then I went into the history and showed how what was written in the doctrines was in fact manifested throughout the course of history in the Islamic world, which of course formerly was all Christian territories, Egypt and Syria and Turkey and so forth. And then I fast forward and we go to today, and we see that the same exact patterns that are proscribed in the Quran and in the Hadith or Islamic scriptures, and that did manifest themselves through 14 centuries of history, are happening again in the same exact patterns today. And what is even more notable is if you look at the fact, and I try to document it, that's why I don't focus on any particular Christian group or any nation. But if you look at all the Islamic world, we're talking about countries, the Arab world, okay, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, these countries, Saudi Arabia and so forth. But also you look into sub-Saharan Africa, okay, the black nations, Nigeria and Sudan and Uganda and Kenya and now the Central African Republic and so forth. And you go far east into Asia, Indonesia and the Philippines and so forth. In these countries, what's interesting is none of these countries share the same race, they don't share the same languages, they don't share the same backgrounds or the same cultures or socio-economic conditions. And yet you will see the same patterns that I discuss in the history happening to Christians all throughout those countries. So what do those countries share? It's Islam. Those are all Islamic countries, and I think that itself is very eye-opening. So this is why I wrote the book, to show the past and the continuity with the present, and to show that it's documentation. It's a real problem, and it's something that people need to be aware of.
Mennesket har altså en tendens til å ville fjerne dem de ikke liker. Kravet om at alle skal være like, tenke likt, mene det samme, ser ut til å være totalitære tendenser som også preger oss i Europa. Hvorfor kan vi ikke respektere forskjellighet? Overlate det til Gud og være dommer mellom oss. Men i stor grad fokuserer media lite på overgrepene mot kristne. Jeg spør Ibrahim hva han tror drivkreftene bak den rungende mediestillheten.
My belief that it's not covered in the media is because in many ways the persecution of Christians by Muslims is the Achilles heel, as I call it, of the image of Islam. In other words, it is the most thing that could very easily destroy Islam's image, especially in the West. And the reason I say that is because if you have radical Muslims, fundamentalists, jihadis, and so forth, screaming Islamic scriptures and saying jihad and killing infidels and so forth, and their anger and rage is directed towards, let's say, the West or Israel, it'll easily be rationalized by the media and gotten past because they'll say, well, look, they're the underdogs, they're weaker, they have no strength against the West, they have no strength against Israel, and so they resort to this sort of fundamentalist worldview because they're desperate and they're trying to find something to get behind Islam as a slogan, and that's why they say jihad and this forth. But if they actually had their grievances addressed, whatever, the Arab-Israeli conflict or whatever grievances they have against the West, then all of this will go away. And so the media can talk about this, in fact, the government. But when you come to the persecution of Christians by these Muslims, you can no longer use this rationalization because these Christians are the minorities. They're the outnumbered ones. They're the weak ones. They are often of the same race, ethnicity, culture. They have the same names as their Muslim neighbors, right? And the only thing that makes them different, of course, is they're Christians. And so when you see Christians being killed and their churches being bombed habitually, I mean, we're talking hundreds in the last year all around the world by Muslims and attacked for trying to spread the gospel or being critical and speaking free speech and so forth, and all of these things which are banned by Islam, and you find Muslims doing it. It's hard, I think, for the media. The media doesn't want to touch on this because they can no longer fall on the recourse of saying, well, the Muslims are the underdogs. They have no choice. This is how they have. Because now they're the strong ones. They're in the position of Israel or in the West. They're the majority. They have the power. And yet you see them making the lives of their minorities of living hell. And so the media, I think, develops an instinct not to cover that because it knows that there's no way to cover it. And worse, if you connect the dot, if I'm a viewer and I start watching and understanding that Christians are being persecuted by Muslims just because they're Christians, then perhaps I may start connecting the dots and think to myself, well, maybe that's why Muslims have a problem with Israel. Maybe that's why Muslims have a problem with the West. Maybe that's why Muslims have a problem with their neighbors everywhere, as the book, The Clash of Civilizations, which was very popular in America by Samuel Huntington, a professor, said. He said the borders of Islam, wherever you have Islam bordering non-Muslims, are at war. And so I think when you focus on Christian persecution, outnumbered people, they're the same language, race, nothing distinguishes them from their Muslim neighbors, except they're Christians and they're being killed and slaughtered. You can start understanding that perhaps Islamic hostility for the rest of the world, Israel, West, whoever, is actually more intrinsic, and it's just intolerance. It's not based on grievances.
But I would also question, because when you look at the Western media as well, they always tend to show Muslims with burning flags and angry mobs screaming wildly, all kinds of, and I think that is also an unfair thing, because in the Muslim world, we know, and also in the West, there are so many peace-seeking Muslims as well that also feel bad about the fact that the Western media always portrays Muslim as some crazy people running in the street, uncivilized. So what do you say to that?
Well, what I would say to that is actually, I think when the media shows Muslims burning a flag and doing this, it's still actually sympathetic in the sense that if it's being done against, as it usually is, America or Europe or Israel, then it looks to the viewer as just frustration. These people are so frustrated, and that's why they are as angry and fanatical and violent as they are. Because the more violent they are, the more we are to understand that that is their reaction to our oppression. And so no matter how violent they are, there will be. So it's easy to get away with that and show it. But to show, how often will you see the media showing Muslims burning churches and screaming and lighting it and torching it? It's usually, okay, it's against an American flag or Israeli flag. It's against a strong state, a power. But that's easily understood. You're the underdog. You can get away with acting that way. But you're burning a church that for no reason except a small minority of people who want to go and pray, and you're not allowing them just because you hate them because of what they want to do, then that shows me this intolerance that we're seeing is all interconnected, and it's not about politics or territory or grievance. It's about something a little more ingrained.